Welcome back to your Key Concepts lecture. Today we are reviewing sections 5 and 6 from our textbook, Fundamentals of Corrections. In section 5, we will cover rehabilitation and treatment in more depth. We will look at the behavioral theories often employed in rehabilitation programs, the types of programs that are generally offered, and what types of therapies are included in those, and the common issues prevalent in the current system. We will also discuss some uncommon approaches to rehabilitation. We will then take a deeper look at some of the more specific challenges that arise with housing and rehabilitating two different groups, women and those with mental health disorders. As a very quick refresher, we know that there are several approaches to to, to corrections. There's punishment, where we want the offender to take accountability and be punished for committing an offense. There is also a utilitarian approach that focuses on rehabilitation so that the offender can work on leading a lawful life. Of course, there is also the rising restorative justice approach that centers on victim and human and community healing. And as we know, oftentimes these philosophies are at tension with one another. Do we want to incarcerate someone for a longer time? Or should we reduce the incarceration period and focus more on rehabilitative efforts? The rehabilitative programs that are in place now are often criticized for being ineffective. There's a huge resource issue, and there is the issue of how well they actually help set up the offender for success. There are three main approaches to existing rehabilitation programs: behavioral theories, social learning theories, and the risk needs responsivity model. Under behavioral theories, there is an effort to help to help modify offender criminal behavior by helping to change thought patterns. Some programs rely on operant conditioning whereby we reward positive behavior and discourage negative behavior with consequences. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is often found in these programs. It aims to identify and change distorted beliefs and reinforce positive choices. This approach can be helpful with those needs to develop better tools to manage their anger management, problem solving, and moral reasoning. Social learning theories highlight the influence of the social environment. Role-playing and group therapy is often used to help offenders learn social skills and pro-social behavior. The hope is to help offenders and develop a more positive social network that doesn't lead to peer pressure for the offender to engage in unlawful conduct. The risk needs responsivity model is a framework that tries to take an individualistic approach. It focuses on three principles that I'm sure you could guess from the name of the model: risk, need, and responsivity. First, the risk component asserts that the level of intervention should correspond to the offender's risk of recidivism. I'll say that again. The risk component asserts that the level of intervention should correspond to the offender's risk of recidivism. So, the higher risk the individual is, the more intense intervention that is required. The need component looks at the criminogenic needs, such as substance abuse, antisocial attitudes, and employment skills. The responsivity principle focuses on the learning style of the offender. We see three approaches in the several different types of rehabilitation programs offered, which include substance abuse, CBT therapy programs, educational and vocational training, and social support and reintegration programs. In the substance abuse program, the aim is to reduce dependency on substances. Individual and group therapy using CBT is common, along with medications such as methadone, excuse my pronunciation of the medications, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. Therapies also try to equip offenders with the tools needed to prevent relapse. Contingency management is one way that the programs promote society. In contingency management, positive behaviors are rewarded with tangible items and incentives. CBT programs get their own category, though it is a common approach in many different therapy programs. CBT is often used in structured group sessions that encourage offenders to reflect on their thoughts and behaviors while learning from each other. It can cover anger management, moral reasoning, and impulse control. If we can change thought patterns to be healthy and positive, then we can help the person lead a lawful life. Educational and vocational training programs were discussed as a critical component of reintegration as well. Included in this category are basic literacy, GED prep, college courses, and an opportunity to learn practical skills such as carpentry, welding, culinary arts, and information technology. These programs can provide both a feeling of self empowerment and the skills needed to obtain a job after the program is completed. The social reintegration programs include assistance with housing, employment counseling, and life skills. Mentors, where formerly incarcerated individuals connect, take on a mentee, are common. These programs also focus on helping the offender build a positive support network through family relationships and community ties, as these are essential for emotional support and stability. The correction system also attempts to create programs for specific populations, which include mental health treatment, trauma informed programs, and gender responsive programs. While we tackle those three populations in a bit, we will tackle two other special needs populations now: sex offenders and veterans. Sex offenders are generally required to attend a sex offender specific therapy as part of their sentence. There's a wide spectrum of offenses that may have been committed by a sex offender, ranging from non contact offenses to violent crimes. CBT is often used in these programs to target distorted thinking patterns and promote healthy behaviors. It also aims to enhance empathy, self control, and decision making. To help prevent relapse, these programs also aim to teach offenders to manage high risk situations and triggers that may otherwise lead to criminal behavior. This subset of programs faces an increased difficulty with balancing competing goals of public safety and an offender's needs. You may see these tensions at play with the need to notify and the need to keep the public safe. There is also recognition that veterans require specialized treatment. While some jurisdictions offer a diversion court for qualifying veterans, others offer specially tailored rehabilitation programs that acknowledge the issues that commonly appear among veterans, including post traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, substance abuse disorders, and difficulties reintegrating into civilian life. Other issues include limited resources, ineffective communication, inequitable access to technology, and a lack of data to see if the programs are actually working. These are the most common obstacles, but there are a number of other issues that also come up, including the issues of how to motivate an offender to change their thoughts and behavior. All of the money and expertise and data sharing won't help if the offender doesn't want to change behavior. Lack of motivation to engage in these programs may be influenced by bad past experiences, trauma, and/or substance abuse issues. Some of the ways to try to combat the lack of motivation are motivational interviewing techniques, setting achievable goals, and providing personalized feedback that emphasizes the benefits of participation. As part of your prep work for this week, I included an article on a prison in Norway and two videos about rehabilitation in the United States. The first video takes a look at several different rehabilitation programs in the United States. There's the Exotic Zoo, a financial program, the Mustang Wranglers, the drama program, and a dance program. While the video gives no indication whether these programs actually reduce recidivism from a statistics standpoint, they are a unique approach to providing a bit of humanity while incarcerated. And certainly there was anecdotal evidence within the videos that the people who benefited both from the programs and who helped staff the programs thought that the programs were effective. I find the idea of taking care of the animals particularly interesting, that perhaps the bonding with another creature and the taking care of that creature may help with the mental health issues that often arise while incarcerated, even if you didn't suffer from an issue prior to incarceration. Because as we know, The living conditions are very rough, and it can really exacerbate existing mental health issues and create mental health issues where none previously existed. In the second video, the speaker proposes eradicating the tension between the competing goals in the criminal justice system by creating one track for punishment and another track for rehabilitation. He doesn't really get into specifics, but I thought he had several interesting points, including the practical reality that not all prisons have the same types of rehabilitation programs one might need. Instead, if one is being sentenced to a place on need rather than security risk, then the programs would be waiting for the offender. In other words, he said that when you get placed at a prison, you're being sentenced based on your um, risk. So you're being sent to a minimum risk facility or a medium risk facility or a high risk facility, the Goldilocks approach that we discussed in the last module. And he thinks that you should instead be sentenced based on need, not on based on your risk level. And that way, you would be sentenced to a facility that it would have the type of program that you need. I wondered how this approach could balance with the different security risks all found within one facility. Because theoretically, you would have minimum, medium, and maximum risk offenders all in the same facility. And we do perhaps see a version of this in Norway, which is described in the article from The Guardian. There, in Norway, any security level risk with any type of conviction can apply to be housed at this prison during the last 5 years of one sentence. It is described as very different from prisons as we know it and has a much lower rate of recidivism. It does seem like there's a level of practical learning with the ability to work on the premises and grow food. And of course, there's a baseline level of humanity being offered to the inmates. But to get into this prison in the first place, the offender has to pledge a commitment to leading a lawful life. And I wonder how much this makes a difference. It seems like the offender may already be motivated to live a lawful life, and therefore rehabilitation efforts would be more effective anyway. Because as we discussed earlier, one of the issues that comes up is a lack of motivation. So all of the inmates applying to live at this prison are already pledging that they are motivated to live this lawful life. So you're dealing with a different population in the first place that may skew the results. This model also seems to be similar to the idea of a built-in halfway house, and I also wonder how much that helps prepare the offenders for reintegration into society after they are released. I want to hear what you think and how you would model your own unicorn of a rehabilitation program. One of the assignments this week is going to ask you to create a promotional flyer for your own program. You can be as creative and or as practical as you want when designing your program. Just be sure that you're following the instructions as they are written in the assignment. Now let's get into how corrections handles unique challenges and obstacles with women and those with mental health disorders. The rate of incarcerated women in the last years have significantly increased. We went from 26,326 incarcerated women in 1980 to 180,684 incarcerated women in 2022. Though many more men are in prison than women, the rate of growth for female imprisonment has been twice as high as that of men since 1980. And here's a graph showing the rise of this incarceration and how that has played out since 1980 to 2022. And as we can see in 2022, it looks like the jail and state prisons are pretty split, and then federal prison has the lowest number. And interestingly, back in 1980 and 1985, that number was nearly non existent for federal prisons. So it seems like state prisons and the local jails have traditionally housed most of the women who are incarcerated. And then here's another graph showing that the number of women involved in the correction system as it plays out through prison, jail, probation, and parole. And as you can see, the system does tend to put women on probation instead of prison and jail, as the number is incredibly or disproportionately larger than it is for probation than it is for prison, jail, and parole. Parole being the smallest number there. And then just to maybe it's in this one. Yeah. And just to back up for a moment, back here when we get back to 2020, if you notice that dip in 2020 from COVID, there was a huge release in offenders when COVID hit as this jails tried to minimize the spread of COVID within their facilities, and there was a mass release of offenders that were least likely to commit another crime. So the low violent, low risk um, incarcerated individuals were all released. So you can see the number went down in 2020 when the big release happened, and then it starts to climb back up as we kind of got over that. And then our last graph on this is here showing that the percentages of incarcerated men and women for specific types of crimes. And you can see that for violent crimes, 64% of the incarcerated individuals are men and 46% are women. That number is much different when it comes to property crimes and public order crimes. Those are very, very similar numbers. For property crimes, and drug crimes, in fact, women commit more of these, are incarcerated more for property and drug crimes than men are. And then for public order crimes, it's pretty equal at 11% and 10%. And in fact, women in state prisons are more likely than men to be incarcerated for a drug or property offense. 25% of the women in prison have been convicted of a drug offense, compared to just 12% of men in prison. And 19% of incarcerated women have been convicted of a property crime, compared to just the 13% among incarcerated men. And we can kind of see how this happens with the drug crimes from this chart here below that shows that there's a substance, um, you start with a trauma. I mean, you really could just pick anywhere on the chart, right? But here we'll start with trauma, with the experiences of trauma increasing risk or worsen mental health conditions, which leads then to the worsening of the untreated mental health conditions compound, and women tend to use substances to manage those issues. Then we get to the substance abuse, and at this point, women are charged with the substance related offenses. And then women tend to serve short sentences, and once released, the community women often return to substance use because they weren't given the tools they needed to cope in life. And then we're back again. Women with the substance use abuse disorders are at an increased risk for further victimization, which leads to more trauma, which leads to more untreated mental health issues, which leads to which leads to more coping with substance use, and then more unlawful conduct is committed. So, women offenders typically require different treatment than their male counterparts. There are the obvious issues. They need different amenities and potentially different health care, especially if pregnant while incarcerated. Women are also more vulnerable to sexual abuse while incarcerated, both from correctional staff and from other inmates. Women also typically have a greater mental health needs that have to be addressed. And a unique societal challenge to the increase of women in the correctional facilities is the disruption to family units. Women are typically the caregivers for the children in their family, and their incarceration causes a serious hardship on many families with many ripple effects. In terms of rehabilitation, women need different services than their male counterparts as well. And this is not shocking if we're looking at an individualistic model where we're responding to the actual needs of an offender. Typically, as we saw in the last graph, incarcerated women have a significant trauma in their lives, and they need a trauma-based approach from the therapist running the rehabilitation programs. They also typically need greater access to mental health care. This would require things like mental health screenings, appropriate and responsive counseling services, and trauma informed therapeutic interventions to promote emotional healing and stability. We also want the rehabilitation programs for women who come from a caregiving role to have a family centered approach, to focus on supporting family connections and providing resources for parenting in this modern world that pulls parents in 100 directions at all times. We also need to make sure that women are physically safe from sexual abuse. And just like the rehabilitation is different, reentry is also different, and it can be particularly difficult for women. The female offenders typically serve shorter sentences due to the nature of their crimes. Again, women are more likely incarcerated for drug or property crimes. But they face the same issues as men when they are, uh, and the same as anybody else. They face the same issues that they had before they went into serve their sentence, but then they're in a worse position and they don't know how to care for or provide for their children, how to manage family and personal relationships, how to navigate parenthood with limited resources now with a criminal conviction on their record, and how to do all those things while navigating their own traumas without resorting back to substance abuse and otherwise leading a lawful life. There has been an increased focus on establishing halfway houses for women by nonprofits, such as a New Way of Life Reentry Project in LA. These are not government funded, but they are built by women for women. They know the unique challenges and needs of women. They know the unique struggles of trying to find a job, secure housing, and reconnecting with children and social networks while trying to lead a lawful life is very difficult. While these houses make an enormous difference in the lives that they serve, the houses are few and cannot house all of the women being released from prison. For example, one place called the Angela House in Houston can only serve 12 to 14 women at a time, despite receiving more than 300 applications a year. And again, why is it important to focus on these kind of services? Why not just hand out the incarceration or probation sentence and move on? You fulfill the goal of punishment and you're done. Well, just like with the male counterparts, if we focus on providing women with the right kind of care and support, then we can reduce recidivism, promote public safety, and decrease the overcrowding in the correctional facilities. And in the video that we watched, Susan Burton pointed out that she could have earned several degrees from Yale with all the money that the state spent on her incarceration for substance abuse. All right, so that was women. We also need to talk about the unique challenges facing the mentally ill population in the correction system. The prevalence of mental health disorders among incarcerated populations is vastly larger than the general population. Common disorders include anxiety, depression, PTSD, and substance abuse disorders. These populations present a unique challenge for correctional facilities. Some of the obstacles include inadequate access to treatment, lack of training and support for staff, ensuring safety for the population and for the rest of the population at the correctional facility. And there are special reintegration obstacles. When treatment is available, it usually includes the following: a mental health disorder screening is used to identify those individuals in need of services, trauma informed care, prescribed medication, CBT in both individual and group therapy sessions, and the reliance on peer support groups. Just like with women, there has been a rapid rise in the incarceration of the mentally ill. State hospitals for the mentally ill began to shut down in the 1950s. By the 1980s, most of these state hospitals had been shut down. And with the shutdown of these hospitals was also the shutdown in state funding for the mental health services. Local governments were suddenly required to shoulder the cost of providing mental health services, and they were ill equipped to do so. It is largely agreed that the closure of the public mental health hospitals forced a large number of these deinstitutionalized patients into the criminal justice system. Some scholars argue that the timing doesn't quite line up, so it's not a but for cause. In other words, But for the closure of the public mental health hospitals, the increase in those with mental health disorders in prisons would not have gone up. But it is also true that perhaps prisons just got better at screening for mental health disorders. And it is also true that left unmonitored, those requiring mental health assistance are more likely to commit crimes. If you're unhealthy, you can't make a healthy choice. And prisons have the authority to require inmates to take prescribed medication. So the shutdown of the hospitals and the rise in populations at the prisons makes sense. But as we've talked about and read about, it is hard to get adequate treatment for mental health issues while incarcerated. The staff are often not well versed on how to handle escalating issues with someone who has a mental health issue, which often makes things much worse. We heard in one of the videos that at a particular prison, there were both correctional officers and therapists on staff. There was an escalating issue with an inmate with a mental health issue, and fortunately, a therapist responded before the corrections officer, because if the officer had responded first, the officer likely would have escalated the situation. And not because the officer is a bad person or wants to cause harm, but because the officer is not trained for these situations and the officer's natural inclination to use force or issue clear directives will not be met with obedience and therefore will just escalate the situation. We also read about an article about the treatment of the mentally ill in Florida prisons beginning with Darren Rainey's death. Darren is a famous case in South Florida, and I briefly mentioned it in the last module's lecture. He had a mental health disorder. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. One day, he smeared feces all over himself, and the corrections officer forced him into the shower to clean himself. The shower water, however, was extremely hot, and Darren Rainey was left there for 2 hours. Darren Rainey did not have control to the temperature of the water or or the ability to turn off the water. The officers had that control. And yet, he was left there for 2 hours, and at the end of the 2 hours, he was found dead. The description of his skin when he was found still haunts me. No charges were brought against the corrections officer, though, as we read, though the prison did seem to change the staff up. But as the article mentioned, there seemed to be a culture that seemed to promote blindly following whatever the corrections officers said should happen. So that if there was a whistleblower and someone tried to change or make practices that were better suited for handling those with mental health disorders, the corrections officers did not respond kindly, and instead left those whistleblowers or those who did try and change the system, they left them feeling scared, exposed, and even made threats. How can we expect a change when the staff isn't able to actually implement any changes, when the corrections officers are just off doing their own thing and running their own show and not listening to the people who can help and make change in this regard? We will explore this idea actually more in your second assignment for this module. But for now, we will go back to our lecture and talk about that in addition to the increase in physical force and vulnerability while incarcerated, the mentally ill often face additional hurdles during reintegration, same as women, but there are additional unique challenges to re-entry, and it's the same for the population with mental health disorders. There's limited support services, a main deficit being mental health care. Corrections has responded to some of these issues by increasing the services available by telehealth, creating specialized housing units within the prisons, and promoting better partnerships within the community, and fostering mentorship programs when applicable. And certainly, corrections has tried to increase staff training and mentorship, and some states have done a better job at this than others. But again, there's a general, overall, very limited amount of resources available for this type of thing, and it requires a lot of intensive training, and a lot of effort to be put into it. And that brings us to the close of our Module 3 Key Concepts lecture. So, for your study guide this week, be sure that you understand the goals of rehabilitation and reintegration programs, know the types of therapies that may be used in the various programs, and know the challenges that face our current programs. You'll also want to be familiar with the specific issues that necessitate different treatment for incarcerated women and those with mental health disorders. And I'll see you for the next module, Key Concepts lecture.